I got an email from Brent Spiner, and this is follow up on his previous email that he sent me about Sarah Avery. As you know, she got out of her compound, and my men have been trying to round her up and get her back in quarantine because she's been causing lots of problems. Here's what I heard from Brent. This was November 16th at around 11:30 p.m. Dearest Gail, we are currently working with many of our church missionaries to deliver food to the hungry citizens of San Francisco, as well as help restore local businesses that have been gutted for every last scrap of food and had all of their delivery trucks and advertisements similarly devoured by Sarah Avery. Our helicopter teams had been tracking Sarah as our scientists devised a plan to effectively capture her. I have been kept informed of her trajectory, and I must say, her desperate antics have been as fascinating as they are disturbing. After Sarah ate everything she could find in San Francisco, she began making her way towards the ocean. At first, we weren't sure why she was doing this. We were partly relieved, hoping she was possibly taking a bath, since fat girls tend to smell, and this one both figuratively and literally takes the cake. Ground sources say Sarah was witnessed talking to a civilian. "What's over there?" she was heard asking, panting with hunger. "Well, if you keep going in that direction, you're going to hit Chile," the civilian replied. "Chilies! I love chilies!" Sarah exclaimed, saliva spurting from the crevices of her thick mouth. Panting harder, she began stomping toward the ocean. Apparently, Sarah was confused and thought the person was referring to Chili's, the restaurant. Her floppy body waggled its way into the ocean. One might think she would sink like a rock due to having an internal density approaching a black hole. However, our physicists explain that no matter what, fat always floats on water. Rather than swim, Sarah floated like a gelatinous balloon and was able to easily glide toward the country of Chile. At last we thought, Sarah would be burning calories and become easier to capture. She even began to appear tired. Her efforts at unintentional exercise were quickly neutralized, however, when her presence began attracting the attention of a nearby blue whale. The blue whale saw what appeared to be the fattest female it had ever seen. It eagerly approached Sarah, attempting to mate with her, and on reflex, Sarah's hungry vagina turned on like a vacuum and effortlessly sucked the entire whale inside of her with that bellowing, grieving murmur unique to marine mammals. The whale faded down her hole. Sarah smiled, appearing satisfied, as vaginally consuming the whale appeared to give her the energy she needed to complete her journey. Sarah's hopes were quickly dashed as she arrived on the shores of Chile. Unable to locate the restaurant and realizing her mistake, Sarah began having a massive fat chick tantrum, and in a whirl, she threw herself back into the ocean. This dramatic scene resulted in a tremendous Chilean earthquake that sources say later caused a tsunami off the central California coast. Sarah was tracked, making her way back to the United States, presumably to places that felt most familiar to her. Her first stop was her hometown of Texas, the contents of which only briefly satisfied her hunger before she traveled across the Northeast towards New York. What happened next both pains and sickens me to this moment, and my heart is heavy for the victims of this terrible tragedy. Arriving in New York City, Sarah was growing increasingly anxious to find more food. Gazing around, her wild bovine eyes soon rested upon what appeared to her to be a green woman holding a giant ice cream cone out in the distance, ravenous and unwilling to allow such a thin woman to parade around with an ice cream cone, much less to hold it tauntingly above Sarah's head, like a testament to thin privilege. Sarah began a mad charge toward her. This green woman is known to us as the Statue of Liberty, and once again confused, Sarah vaulted into the air to steal this thin woman's ice cream cone. Sadly, fat women are not very agile, even when very hungry, and as with most fat women, Sarah greatly misjudged her physical capabilities. Fat may float on water, but it doesn't float on air, and midway through the leap, Sarah's fat body came crashing down, vagina first, onto the new World Trade Center. A horrible, slopping, wet, slushing sound, combined with the bellowing screech of twisting metal, reverberated throughout the city as the entire building was being forced deep into Sarah's gaping vagina. Screams from within the building could be heard as its inhabitants quickly realized what was happening to them. Unwilling to succumb to their fate, citizens were actually witnessed jumping from the windows of the World Trade Center during its ascent into Sarah's body, preferring to die from the fall than to have any part of themselves inside a large fat woman's vagina. Disturbingly, due to the gravitational effect of Sarah's massive density, their efforts were in vain. No sooner than they had jumped, their bodies were sucked upward into the vagina by sheer gravitational will, and they met their deaths vaginally. Citizens on the streets began screaming and gawking as the gravitational pull on human bodies began squeezing the jumpers into long, gangly strings in a process physicists refer to as spaghettification. The bodies were in essence being slurped up like noodles, causing shocked onlookers to vomit and faint. There was no hope of escape nor survival for the victims. Although the gruesome horror made the scene feel as though time had slowed, in reality the entire process took mere seconds. Sarah Avery crashed onto the ground, her gigantic fupa slamming the concrete and sending shockwaves throughout the city. Sarah, having taken the entire World Trade Center to the hilt, sat on the ground mortified as she realized she was now being stared at by a crowd of judgmental onlookers. Her face welled up with the heat of humiliation. "It's a myth that fat girls have big vaginas. My vagina is small," she bellowed, beginning to sob, before blubbering onto her feet and escaping back towards the ocean. It's an unfortunate fact that emotional upheaval makes fat girls very hungry, and now the already gargantuan Sarah Avery was hungrier than ever. This was only the beginning of Sarah's warpath. An emotional, hungry fat woman being free to mingle with the general public is equivalent to an angry bull being released into an audience at a rodeo. For women at or above 250 pounds, it's already impossible to go anywhere without being a burden. But Sarah Avery, as one can imagine considering her grotesque inhuman weight, is a special snowflake. Sarah began a journey that spanned multiple countries in search of food, leaving behind nothing but chaos everywhere she went. Ironically, one of Sarah's next stops was the North African coast. At first, we were confused, because Africa is renowned for being a food-scarce continent. Gerard, having a firmer background in bariatric female psychology, said that fat women are usually sheltered creatures without a clear grasp on real-world social issues, which is part of why they don't feel shame for how much they eat. They often dismiss starving third-world children as having thin privilege. When Sarah saw elephants grazing, she figured there must be plenty of food to support her girth, and it confirmed her notion that African people diet on purpose to stay thin for the sole purpose of victimizing fat people. I'm always fascinated by science, but I digress. Sarah began looking around for food on the African plains when, unbeknownst to her, she was being stalked by African poachers. The poachers were at first excited to see what they must have thought was a massive albino elephant and were eager to harvest its ivory. They were about to shoot her when one of the men raised his hand to make them stop. "Asante sana," the man whispered, and hardly able to contain his excitement, continued with rapturous breath, "Wewe nuku mimi apana." Sarah had specifically wound up in the country of Niger, not to be confused with Nigeria, which is south of the Niger border. From what we learned from our anthropologists, Niger as a culture absolutely treasures fat white women. The helicopters tracking this activity sent the audio of their dialogue to our scientists, who were able to run them through our universal translators. It was Niger for, "It's a white woman, where her old man at?" The latter phrase means, "Does she have a man?" The other poachers with there's something in the background, just ignore it. The other poachers with an envious gasp began repeating the first man's words. They were so turned on by Sarah's superhumanly fat, superhumanly pale body, they immediately dropped their guns and, like the blue whale, ran to her to mate. Each man chose a fold of Sarah's body and dove inside, trying to rape her. Now, as to not offend our ethnic and international fans, I want to make sure I clarify here that the men here are not to be perceived as true rapists, as Western Caucasian culture defines rape. Rape is an accepted part of Niger culture, and how many of their babies are traditionally conceived. In Niger communities, it is not seen as a crime. Niger women, in fact, often seek to be raped by as many Niger men as possible to ensure that no two of their children have the same father. This keeps their genetic lines more diverse. That said, Sarah was becoming very agitated. Frustrated by hunger and frightened by the African men, she ran away crying. Heading north, Sarah caught sight of the famous Eiffel Tower and began narrowing in on the city of Paris. The smell of cheese